All right, so let's talk about variables. So classes have variables. They are ways that it can store information, just like variables did before we talked about classes. And the cool part about this is the fact that we've used variables before is very useful here. So here are the three example variables that were in our person class that we looked at the end of last video, this guy up here. A lot of pieces. We're looking at just these three lines. Private static string species equals human, private string name, private int age. So there's some keywords here, but we're seeing a lot of the same stuff we've been doing all year. String species equals human, string name, int age. These things are really familiar to us, and those things are going to stick around. Having a data type, a name for a variable, and potentially initialization with a value, versus down here we just have data type and variable name to give us declaration, string name, int age. Clearly there's a bit of a difference going on here because this first example has two things going on. It actually sets a value, and it has this keyword. You can see its coloring is blue, so it's a keyword, static. And this differentiates between two things called class variables and instance variables. So species here is what's called a class variable. We're going to get way more into that in section 7, but in general, this is what we call a class variable or a static variable, and these two are what we call instance variables. The simplest thing is we use classes to make objects, and when we make an object, it gets copies of all the instance variables because it has those things in every individual object. So every person we create using the person class is going to have a name and an age. Those are instance variables because objects are instances of a class. When we make an object, though, it does not get class variables. This guy up top here with the static keyword. And this is because class variables are meant to be things that are used by all the objects of a class, but aren't going to be different between those objects. It would be a waste of space if we made a string for species for every human or for every person object, because they're always going to have the same value. That would get really wasteful, and so we make it a class variable instead. So variables show up in all sorts of ways. We're primarily going to be focusing on instance variables for the next several sections, but we will talk about static variables in section 7 of Unit 5. And all we need to know is that we would typically use this keyword private. We'll address that more later. And we can use any type we're familiar with: int, double, boolean, string, other classes if necessary, and we give it a variable name to reference it by, things we're already very familiar with. So those are variables. In the next section, we're going to delve into the idea of constructors.